Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
When global supply chains are disrupted, whether by pandemics, geopolitical tensions, policy changes or trade restrictions, countries without their own vaccine and biologics manufacturing capabilities are left vulnerable. They're dependent on imports from established hubs, mostly in Europe, India and China, competing for limited capacity and facing the reality that they have no control over their own medical supply. That's why I'm speaking with Anand Ekambaram today. Anand brings over 30 years of expertise in vaccine and biologics manufacturing. He spent many years at Merck managing manufacture of vaccines, biologics and sterile fill finish operations, both internally as well as through a global network of CDMOs. He then served as Vice President of Global Clinical Supply Chain at Bristol Myers Squibb, and most recently as Executive Director and Head of Manufacturing and Supply Chain Division at CEPI. He developed manufacturing partnerships to build vaccine capabilities in Africa, Asia and South America. Today, through Global BioVax Solutions, he advises NGOs and private equity on vaccine manufacturing and technology transfer. Today, we're going to talk about what it actually takes to build sterile fill-finish capabilities for vaccines and biologics. We'll explore the technical challenges of technology transfer, the non-negotiables when upgrading facilities for aseptic processing, and the strategic case for countries developing their own manufacturing capacity for long-term health security and economic independence. Anand, thank you so much for joining me today.
Dora, I would like to thank you and the team at PharmaSource for this wonderful opportunity to speak about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and has been part of my career.
An absolute pleasure. So you've had a very busy and varied career so far, so including Merck, working in vaccines, biologics and sterile fill finish, and then moved into supply chain at BMS and then CEPI, working with vaccine makers in Africa and Asia. Tell me about that journey. What drew you to focus on manufacturing in the developing world?
So I was fortunate to start my career at Merck during a period of extraordinary growth in vaccines. I joined in the early 90s when the vaccine business at Merck was relatively small. Our sales were of the order of $200 to $300 million. And by the time I left, the sales were about $10 billion. But what mattered most was not the growth. It was the scale of lives saved and diseases prevented, and the chance to work with exceptional scientists, engineers, and manufacturing teams. So that experience taught me what it really takes to develop and manufacture vaccines reliably and at scale. It also exposed me to a hard truth that the vaccines we were making, which had extraordinary public health impact, were primarily being supplied to North America and Western Europe for various reasons, which are quite complex. And if you think of it in terms of birth cohort, these regions account for about 10 million of the total 130 million or so newborns every year. And yet the burden of vaccine preventable diseases is in this area that we were not supplying. So that's what primarily drew me to the idea of trying to work with the developing world markets and trying to see if I could make an impact. Now, while at Merck, I worked on public-private partnerships, transferring vaccine technology to producers in the developing world, but because Merck also was quite conscious of this inequity in supply and public health impact. My later work in external manufacturing and global supply chains at BMS reinforced how complex and fragile those systems really are. Those experiences were impactful, but they taught me a critical lesson that simply transferring products designed for advanced healthcare systems has real limitations when you take it to other markets. So that insight shaped my time at CEPI and continues today in my work as an independent consultant. You just can't transfer vaccines and products built for high-income systems. Durable access requires designing the whole product and supply chain for local realities.
So during our last conversation, when we spoke before, so you mentioned how during COVID, there was a real inequity in vaccine distribution between countries with and without manufacturing capabilities, as you kind of just alluded to it in your answer just then. Can you explain what happened there?
Yes, certainly. So what COVID exposed in a very stark manner was that vaccine access to a large extent followed manufacturing capability and capacity, far more than the public health need. So the countries that had capacity were able to do a really good job of immunizing the people, and the countries that didn't have capacity, even if their public health need was greater, just had to wait in line. Early in the pandemic, when supply was extremely constrained, governments quite rightly prioritized their own populations. That showed up in advance purchase agreements, export controls, and informal prioritization of domestic and regional markets. None of that was surprising, but it had major consequences. Even when global mechanisms like COVAX were created, they were competing for supply in a market where the early production had already been spoken for. Another important factor is that vaccine manufacturing is something that you just can't turn on. Countries without existing fill finish or drug substance capability couldn't simply step in and produce vaccines, even if they had the political will and even if the IP or the know how was being shared. Technology transfer takes time, trained people, regulatory readiness, and a mature supply chain. In a crisis measured in months, not years, these gaps mattered enormously. So the inequity we saw was not just about money or intent, it was structural. It reflected decades of concentration of vaccine manufacturing in a small number of countries. COVID didn't create that imbalance, it revealed it. And that's why there is so much focus on regional manufacturing capacity to take the lessons learned from the last pandemic and prepare for the next one.
Absolutely. And so that brings me to ask about the work you were doing at CEPI during your time there. What were you trying to achieve?
I was brought into CEPI as the executive director and head of the newly created manufacturing and supply chain division, and that role reflected a broader evolution in CEPI's mission. In the early years, CEPI was primarily focused on funding early stage vaccine development for pathogens that are largely a subset of the WHO blueprint pathogen for priority diseases. That work was essential, but over time, and especially with the experience through COVID, it became clear that early development alone was not enough. So CEPI, like much of the global public health community, internalized the lessons from COVID vaccine inequities. We saw that having promising vaccine candidates didn't translate into timely or equitable access without manufacturing capacity, supply chain readiness, and the ability to scale quickly. As a result, CEPI made a deliberate decision to extend its focus beyond early R&D into later stages of development and manufacturing, which is where I came in. It was part of a multidimensional approach supporting not just vaccine development, but the broader ecosystem need to deliver vaccines in low and middle income countries. That included strengthening clinical trial networks, engaging with regulators on new approaches, and critically, building manufacturing and supply chain capability. So, my role was to develop and operationalize that strategy. A key part of that was ensuring that choices made in early development around process design, equipment platforms, critical consumables were compatible with the manufacturing realities in low and middle income countries. In other words, giving developers a line of sight to future manufacturing from the very beginning. In parallel, I built manufacturing partnerships with vaccine producers in low and middle income countries, helping develop their technology capabilities for rapid response, and identified innovative approaches to improve speed, cost, and access. The goal was simple: to make sure that the next outbreak happens, manufacturing readiness is not the limiting factor.
It is really interesting. Obviously, there's so much innovation in the science, but yeah, as you say, it just means nothing to global healthcare if the manufacturing capabilities just aren't up to scratch, especially when it comes to rapid response and pandemic preparedness. Let me ask you, obviously, there's been quite significant shifts in US global health policy under the current administration. How are you seeing this landscape change both internationally and domestically?
Yeah, there are far reaching changes that have come about as a result of not just the new administration's view on certain things, but also because of some of the lessons learned from the geopolitical tensions that happened in the years before, as well as the disruptions and the potential disruptions due to COVID. COVID made everybody aware that the globalized supply chain, with its sole focus on cost, was not resilient when it came to a pandemic, even if the actual disruption did not materialize. So I'll focus on manufacturing and I'll talk about three areas. The first is the withdrawal of funding for global health. The second is the trade policy changes and the tariff changes. And the last one is the changing perspectives that the new administration has on the importance of vaccines itself and then raising concerns about safety. Now, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a vaccine safety person, I'm not a public health specialist, so I'll focus on the manufacturing and supply chain. So, as a result of withdrawal of funding for global health agencies, especially to agencies like Gavi, which had done a stellar job in these past years in bringing vaccines to low income countries, we should expect to have a very significant impact on the immunization programs that take place in the low income countries and the public health impact that goes with it. To the best of my knowledge, about 15% of Gavi's funding, for example, was coming from the US government, and that money is no longer there for vaccines and immunization. So they'll have to figure out other ways to do it. And I don't know their response yet. I don't know the response of public health agencies yet. But this could lead to significant cutbacks in certain immunization programs. So then let's talk about trade policy and tariffs. As I said, the new administration has created both incentives to reshoring as well as barriers to importing in the form of tariffs. But the trend towards reshoring actually started earlier, as I said, with geopolitical tensions and because of COVID, exposing the fragility of supply chains. So now you have in US alone, companies largely have announced investments up to $300 billion on reshoring. Now, I don't have precise estimates about how much of this is going towards new manufacturing capacity, but I think a significant amount is going towards new manufacturing capacity. Now, what will be the impact of that? Now, I tend to think that the CMOs and CDMOs, individual areas may see certain impacts where volumes are pulled from them, especially from their European operations into reshoring into internal manufacturing. But the CDMO and CMO industry as a whole, I think will do fine. And this is the reason why I say that, or at least at this time, and I think this is my assessment. First and foremost, all these manufacturing capacity that has been announced is not going to be online for at least 4 to 5 years. That's how long it takes to build, to qualify, to validate, and get licensure for a new manufacturing facility, especially for vaccines and biologics. Number two, if you see that the CDMO industry as a whole gets about 50% of its business, 50% of the new clinical trial starts are coming from small and medium-sized biotech companies, which don't have their manufacturing capacity. And they're not the ones announcing these huge investments. It's the big pharma. So they still need a place to make their clinical supplies. So that ecosystem is still vibrant. And of course, they will look for CMO, CDMO talent. Lastly, I think we talked about the changes in attitudes towards vaccines that are reflecting in policy changes at the FDA level, especially for vaccines. What this has done is to have a chilling effect on innovation. I'm aware of at least 2 or 3 startup companies that have either lost funding or unable to get funding in spite of having very promising clinical data that would have normally been funded. So innovation has had a chilling effect, even while the overall biopharma sentiment index that's being published by Endpoints has shown an uptick. So it's a vaccine sector that has been very badly affected by the policy changes because investors simply don't want to take a risk on vaccines till they get clarity on policy.
What do you see as a potential impact of the reduction in innovation for future pandemic preparedness?
We have to see how it plays out. It's too early to tell. But if you take away funding from research and development, especially for those diseases that have pandemic potential, these programs are going to get delayed. We're going to lose time. And some of the time you just can't make up later on with more funding. Or other sources of funding have to come in. So I think we have to see how it plays out. I can't imagine that the US, which is the largest funder in terms of research and development of these products, that the funding withdrawal can be managed with other sources of funding.
And so there's this concept of countries having ownership over their vaccine supply, as we were talking about earlier. What does domestic vaccine manufacturing capability actually deliver beyond just pandemic preparedness?
Yeah. So domestic vaccine manufacturing delivers more than pandemic preparedness. It improves the reliability of supply. It strengthens routine immunization programs because countries that have their own supply have better immunization programs. It builds a skilled workforce and industrial capability that can then spill over to other sectors. It also gives the countries more agency in how products are designed, priced, and supplied. Manufacturing can also be a starting point into more complex parts of the value chain, including product development. And this we have seen happen in other industries. It's also important to recognize that building capacity just for pandemics is not economically viable. Pandemic demand is episodic, while routine immunization is continuous. At CEPI, the strategy we developed was to support manufacturing capability for routine vaccines while ensuring that the equipment, the supply chain, and the processes could be rapidly repurposed for the pandemic response. That said, not every country should build their own manufacturing end-to-end capability. Regional or specialized capability makes much more sense. So the goal isn't self-sufficiency, it's resilience, meaningful participation, and agency. For these countries that haven't had a voice, they have primarily been recipients of the vaccines, for them then to have a say in how things are developed and supplied.
Let's get into the sort of weeds of building new capabilities and facilities. What are the main sort of non-negotiables when assessing whether a facility can be upgraded for sterile fill finish?
I think the foundational element of any of the new or upgraded biologics and vaccine manufacturing facilities is people and quality systems. You can buy equipment if it's sufficient funding, but the people factor and the quality systems cannot be purchased. They have to be developed. So that is, for me, number one. Then some of the other elements that we look at if you're looking to upgrade is looking at the facility layout and airflow. You need fundamentally correct what I call the bones and skeleton of the facility to make sure that the people flows, the material flows, pressure cascades, and the space are appropriate to support the kind of operations we want to build. If the basic architecture fights aseptic behavior and processes, you can't fix that with equipment. It's better to then start from scratch and build a new facility. The second one is utilities and infrastructure. Are they appropriate? Are they correctly sized? Is there reliable water supply and power supply? And the third is the contamination control capability. That includes environmental monitoring programs, cleaning and disinfection processes, gowning, and the ability to implement a credible contamination control strategy. Regulators are not going to approve something if they don't see a robust contamination control strategy. Fortunately, contamination control strategy can be put into place if you have appropriate infrastructure, utilities, and facility layouts, and the quality systems.
There was a lot there. Let's start with, you mentioned people. So do you encounter challenges when building manufacturing capabilities in terms of getting enough talented staff and training programs in lower and middle income countries?
Yeah, and it can be. I'll say that many of the manufacturing network partners that I had worked with had extremely talented staff. The way I look at this people element is in developing countries, actually, we find very high potential people.
Well, of course, yeah.
So they're usually some of the best and brightest from the universities who take up this job. So it's not a question of their qualifications or their ability to learn. It's simply that in some cases, they have not been exposed to the needs of a modern GMP environment. And quality systems and good GMP behavior is not something you can pick up in a classroom or a training session. It's very much a learn by doing learning strategy. So you have to constantly plan, do, check, act, and then follow that cycle till you become a really strong GMP organization. So that's what I find is that simply there hasn't been that emphasis on constantly upgrading GMP skills. And these countries also have to decide what is the right level of GMP and risk management for them. We simply can't take something that's from here and plant it there. I think most GMP regulations, though, I'll say, are very well founded in the idea of preventing contamination and mix-ups. But how you go about implementing it in local place, I think there should be flexibility and some risk-based thinking applied to it.
Then on the sort of technical side, water for injection is critical for sterile manufacturing. What are the challenges when you're working in environments potentially with unreliable water supplies or tropical climates? Mm-hmm. How do you design systems that can handle those sorts of constraints?
Yeah, so when you site a manufacturing facility in an area, you have to take into account the issues of infrastructure, not just water, power supply, movement of materials in and out of the facility, cold storage and distribution systems, right? Now, specifically to your question about water, yeah, water can be a problem. It can be a seasonal issue. And But I think with some additional investment, we can get over that problem in terms of making sure that there's a dedicated water source and that if the typical treated water which a US facility might have is not available, is to put in additional pretreatment systems. There's also a design strategy that we can employ to minimize water supply needs. If you look at a biopharma facility, typically the largest amount of water for injection consumption is usually for cleaning the systems. You have fixed equipment that need to be cleaned between batches. And to some extent, you can significantly cut down water consumption by opting to use disposable equipment, which then, of course, has its own challenges and its own cost challenges as well. But that's one way you can minimize WFI requirements. So it's often we look at this on a case by case basis.
During the tech transfer process of a sterile fill finish from a well-established site to one that is still developing, what are the key challenges there? Is it the equipment, training, documentation, technology differences, or something else?
Yeah. So in my experience, the biggest challenges in biopharma, especially in sterile fill finish, it's rarely about equipment. Equipment can be purchased and installed. You do have to make sure that there are adequate service networks available locally, and you have to pay attention to that when selecting the equipment. What you can't have is for a critical piece of equipment that the nearest service provider is based in Europe, and there's an 8-hour flight time to get to what you want to do. So you do have to take that into account. So equipment can be purchased and installed. The harder part is transferring the system and the behaviors that are required. So training is critical, but it's not just task-based training. It's about building a real understanding of contamination control, why controls exist, how to interpret environmental monitoring data, and how to respond when things drift. Documentation often exists, but the challenge is translating procedures written for a mature site into practices that make sense in the developing world. So one strategy that we developed at CEPI and we funded our network partners is the whole concept of a sandbox. So what a sandbox is simply a smaller scale operation where you can, at a much lower cost, run the process and use that to what I call the learn by doing element. It provides an opportunity for the learn by doing element for the local staff. Is you practice at small scale and you use that as a way to then build competency for large scale. So the short answer is equipment is easy. The real challenge is building robust quality systems, contamination control discipline, and an aseptic culture that can sustain performance long after the tech transfer team has left.
Sterile fill finish relies obviously on very specialized equipment, supplies, starting materials that often need to be sourced globally. Obviously, you kind of mentioned they can be supplied and sourced, but how do you build supply chain resilience into these sort of manufacturing networks if specialized equipment has to come from, different parts of the globe?
Yeah. So supply chain resilience works best when it's designed in from the very beginning in the overall product development process. It starts with product and process design, not after a facility is built and after it's operational. So during product development, the choices around equipment platforms, reagents, consumables, drug product containers all have long-term supply chain consequences. If you select specialized bespoke equipment, then that is setting the stage for later problems. So you may get efficiency in the short term, but you will get fragility in the long term. Designing for resilience means favoring standardized platforms, materials with multiple qualified suppliers, and components that can be sourced globally. So those decisions determine how quickly you can scale, how quickly you can transfer manufacturing, and how exposed you are during a crisis. From there, resilience can also be reinforced through dual sourcing, qualification of alternate components, and supplier partnerships. The foundation is set much earlier in development, not during commercial manufacturing. There are also some other strategies you can follow, and these are things like paying for an equipment stockpile or supply stockpile, and having really contractual agreements that make sure that you can get supplied and that your supply won't be subverted because there's a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And ultra cold storage is another thing that many vaccines obviously require. What's realistic for facilities in countries with maybe unreliable power grids? How do you design processes around these types of constraints?
That is a relatively simpler problem to solve. It is of course expensive because we advise that even if power supply is reliable, even in advanced countries, we would recommend that critical cold storage facilities have backup power sources, whether through a digital generation system, because even in these markets, a major thunderstorm or a tornado or something can take out power, and you don't want your ultra cold storage to go down. So backup generation capacity with a reliable fuel source would be the way we solve those problems.
You've mentioned a couple of times, all you need is money and we can solve these problems, which sounds very simple, obviously, but in reality, unfortunately, it's not. How do you, obviously, as someone who has a long background in thinking about policies and things like that, how can we kind of incentivize maybe more well economically developed countries to even the playing field?
I hope I didn't convey the impression it was all about money. In some cases, it does take more money. But it's a fair point. Some of these vaccine manufacturing processes are capital intensive processes. And there is no getting around that, at least now, until we come up with better manufacturing processes that are far more efficient and less capital intensive. I'll say that in terms of funding, there are many avenues. Clearly, this is not my area of expertise, but I'm very impressed by the commitments that have been made both by the governments of developed countries in Europe until recently from the US and also from NGOs. Foundation, to give you one example, has been quite generous in funding for training and for other purposes in Africa. You have multilateral funding agencies that are often willing to lend to such ventures. And you have organizations like the Gates Foundation, which are very generous and have made a great impact in terms of product development as well as for building facilities in the developing world. And of course, my previous employer, CEPI, is definitely one of the places that people go to secure funding for upgrading manufacturing capabilities. So there are many sources of funding available. It's always challenging to get funding because there are more people who need funding than the funding is available. But I believe that it can be obtained. What we have to give thought to is to how is this going to be a commercially sustainable venture? I think that's a question that most funders have. I'm happy to give you a grant or a loan, but let's look at the business plan for how this will be commercially sustainable. And that's where I think more work needs to be done in developing operating paradigms as to how this product will raise revenue that can then pay back that loan. And organizations like Gavi, for example, have made commitments that if there is a developing world supplier, especially in Africa, that they will give preference, some degree of preference to sourcing from those suppliers as to their traditional sources.
As you mentioned, under the new administration, that's left quite a lot of big economic gaps in global healthcare. Do you have thoughts on how those sort of gaps can be filled?
For me, it's a little bit early to comment on how some of those gaps can be filled. Because a lot of the funding withdrawals were from public health programs, not necessarily from manufacturing programs, such as the immunization programs that I talked about earlier. In terms of building manufacturing infrastructure, that is something that is still evolving, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
From a purely economic standpoint, when does it actually make sense to invest in local fill finish capacity versus shipping finished products from established manufacturing hubs? Where's the sort of tipping point there?
Yeah, no, very good question. And it ties into the local manufacturing question that we made earlier. So from a purely economic standpoint, local manufacturing makes sense when the demand is large and it is sustainable and predictable. And when the cost of disruption becomes unacceptable. So for small or intermittent volumes, shipping finished product from established hubs is almost always a cheaper option. The tipping point comes with sustained routine immunization volumes and when logistics, cold chain risk, lead times, or waste start to add to real cost. COVID showed that delays aren't just inconvenient, they're economically and socially expensive and disastrous. That's why regional fill finish anchored in routine demand, but able to surge in a crisis often ends up being the most rational economic choice. I'll say that there is a scale issue, and I mentioned this earlier, that it's not feasible for every small or medium-sized country to have its own self-sufficient vaccine manufacturing industries because it's a capital-intensive process, and therefore it's just not economically sustainable to supply a small population. I do believe that there's a critical mass of population that has to be served before such investments become feasible. And I estimate that somewhere between half a billion to a three quarters of a billion population. Obviously, it depends much more on the birth cohort. That's what drives the volumes. Usually, you find that countries with populations above 400 or 500 million are able to make this a viable business proposition. So if you don't have that population, the solution is easily to obviously to form a regional consortium, which of course is easier said than done.
If you were to devise the perfect global vaccine network from scratch today, what would it look like?
It's a very interesting question. And this is something that requires a lot of thought, but here are some of the preliminary thoughts. I think it won't be one massive centralized system, and it also won't be every country trying to do everything. So we have those two extremes. We've shown the first one didn't work during COVID. It would be a federated network built around regional hubs with some degree of specialization and strong interoperability. You look at the whole picture, you could think of a small number of global centers with advanced R&D and platform development. Around those, you build regional manufacturing hubs with standardized proven platforms, especially for sterile fill finish, that support routine immunization and then can surge and flip over to pandemic products when you need it. So that requires advanced thought to make sure that you develop these products in a common technical platform. I would distribute those hubs geographically to reduce concentration risk and align with regional disease burdens. The other thing I would do is to design that network from end to end. Product and process choices would favor platforms, containers, and consumables that are transferable across sites. So this speaks to the interoperability element. And it also work on harmonizing regulatory approaches so that manufacturing and tech transfer doesn't have to start from zero each time. So supply chains would be, in my perspective, should be built for resilience, particularly for vaccines, not just for cost. Cost is important, don't get me wrong, but you can't be solely focused on cost. And then critically, the system would need to have clear enforceable rules for how vaccines are allocated in a crisis. That is one of the lessons we learned from the COVID pandemic. Vaccines can't simply flow to the highest bidder or only to countries that manufacture them. Allocation has to be based on public health need and agreed principles. Otherwise, even the best designed network, that'll fail. And lastly, the system has to be continuously warm. What I mean by that is you can't have a facility that's built for a surge that has not been operational for a couple of years and expect to start it and supplying product when there is a surge need. They need to be producing routine vaccines every day, building workforce skills and quality culture. So when a pandemic hits, you're scaling up, not starting over.
It really interests me the kind of balance between, obviously, it's not feasible to have empty manufacturing facilities just for whenever the next pandemic happens, but you need to kind of have that balance of something that's kind of continuously used. But how is it then possible to kind of be working at a kind of a good level of capacity usually, but then also still have that huge scalability when a pandemic hits?
Yeah. Facilities like that, by the way, are not just empty facilities. Are economically, they're not viable, obviously, but also they don't meet the need of supply because you just can't start up and run supply. So how do we achieve this balance? I think we start with looking at a region with the critical mass that I just described and looking at what their routine vaccine and immunization needs are and start to make those products. And then when you develop vaccines for pandemic use is to use technology platforms that these routine vaccines are already using. And then you need to have a inventory management strategy where you say, okay, if a pandemic hits, I may have to flip over my production to make pandemic vaccines for 6 to 9 months, let's say. And that is the inventory you build up of your routine vaccines, because the last thing you want to do in a pandemic is disrupt routine vaccine supply. That can have a major pandemic impact too. So I believe that with this kind of an approach, that you can have an economically viable and sustainable operation serving a certain critical mass of population and being able to build the resilience and the kind of regional supply chain that we've been talking about.
Really, really fascinating, Anand. Thanks again for letting me pick your brain today. It's been really, really interesting.
My pleasure, and thank you, Dora, and the team at PharmaSource. This was a wonderful discussion.